Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A man standing in a driveway somewhere in New Jersey. It's a Saturday morning in 1954. He's wearing a white undershirt, khaki trousers with a crease sharp enough to cut bread, and leather shoes that he polished last night out of pure habit. He's holding a garden hose. The lawn behind him is already trimmed. The car beside him already gleams. The house at his back is painted, shuttered, and geometrically correct. From the outside, he looks like a man who has figured it out. From the inside, well, that's what tonight is about. Welcome back. Settle in wherever you are. Pull that blanket up. Adjust the pillow to the exact angle that makes your neck finally relax. If you've got a fan running somewhere in the background, let it fill the room with that low, even hum that makes everything feel a little more distant, a little more manageable. You're safe here. You're comfortable. And you've got nowhere to be for the next little while except right here, drifting through a piece of American history that doesn't get told nearly enough. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with the 1950s American man. Not the one from the television commercials or the magazine spreads or the black and white family photos on someone's grandmother's mantle. We're going to look at the real one, the one behind the perfectly knotted tie and the freshly mown lawn, the one who carried an enormous amount of weight and was never once supposed to mention it. If someone suggested this topic to you or to this channel, thank you. These are the kinds of histories that deserve their own quiet hour. The people who lived them rarely got to tell them, and that's exactly why we should. Now, before we go any further, if you're finding value in what we do here, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps. And if you're listening on Spotify, welcome. There's a whole library waiting for you there. Tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is. I love knowing that someone in Auckland is drifting off while someone in Minnesota is just starting their morning commute. All right, lights low, shoulders down. Let's go back. The year is 1952. Somewhere in the middle of America, it could be Ohio, it could be California, it could be the newly constructed suburbs of Long Island, a man wakes up at 6:15 in the morning. He does not lie there and think about his feelings. He does not reach for his phone and scroll through the warm blue glow of other people's carefully curated lives. He swings his legs over the side of the bed, puts his feet on the hardwood floor, and begins assembling himself for the day. And here is the thing about that assembly. It is not optional, it is not flexible, and it carries a weight that is difficult to fully appreciate from where we're sitting 60-something years later, because by the time that man stands up from the bed, he has already been measured. By the neighborhood, by the office, by the cultural expectations of post-war America that settled over every household like something invisible and perfectly heavy. He doesn't know exactly when those expectations were handed to him, probably around the time he was 8 years old and someone told him to shake hands like he meant it, or when he was 12 and cried about something and someone with good intentions and genuinely limited emotional vocabulary told him to toughen up. By the time he's a grown man with a mortgage and a family and a job he probably didn't choose so much as arrive at, the expectations are so deeply embedded they feel like his own personality. That's the trick of cultural expectation. It stops feeling like a cage once you've forgotten you stepped into one. So let's walk through his morning, not to mock it, not to judge it, but to understand it, because understanding it tells us something important about where we came from and what we inherited. The alarm goes off. Or maybe it doesn't. A man of the 1950s often woke before the alarm, not because he was particularly well rested, but because his nervous system had been trained by years of early departures to surface from sleep like a soldier at reveille. He lay there for perhaps 30 seconds, just 30, and then the list assembled itself in his mind the way a grocery receipt materializes when you reach the checkout line, immediate, comprehensive, and slightly more than you were hoping for. The bathroom came first.
The shaving ritual of the post-war American man was not a casual thing. There were no five-blade cartridge razors with moisture strips and ergonomic handles. There was a double-edged safety razor, a badger hair brush, a bar of shaving soap that he worked into a thick lather in a ceramic mug that probably belonged to his father. The shave was performed with the careful, methodical attention of someone who understood that the results would be visible to every person they encountered today, and that visible imprecision was a form of public statement. A nick on the jaw became a small piece of tissue paper stuck to the face, which was technically a solution, but aesthetically a problem for the next 20 minutes. Then the hair. Men's hair products in the 1950s had names that sounded like they were designed to convey authority: Brile Cream, Vitalis, Wild Root Cream Oil. A small amount worked through with a comb until every strand occupied its assigned position and showed no indication of ever planning to leave. The part was straight. This was non-negotiable in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain to anyone who has grown up in an era that celebrates effortless bedhead as an aesthetic. In 1952, a crooked part suggested a man who couldn't get the basics right, and the basics were always being evaluated. The shirt came next. White most days, or pale blue if it was a Friday and the atmosphere at the office skewed slightly relaxed. Pressed the night before, or pressed that morning by someone in the household, and here is one of those quiet arrangements that structured domestic life in ways nobody ever fully acknowledged. The iron and the ironing board were in most households operated by the wife, which meant that a significant portion of a man's external presentation was produced by labor that was invisible, in the same way that the labor that kept the house clean and the children fed and the social calendar organized was invisible. Not because anyone was being deliberately dishonest, but because the architecture of the arrangement made it disappear into the background. The tie was a performance in itself. The knot had to sit correctly, a small, clean dimple just below the knot, the tip of the tie touching the belt buckle with an accuracy that communicated either precision or carelessness, depending on how well you had done it. Too short, and you looked like a man who hadn't tried. Too long, and you looked like a man who had tried and failed, which was somehow worse than not trying. The jacket last, and then the mirror check, performed with an expression that communicated casual confidence and in no way communicated that you were checking yourself in the mirror. Here's the modern translation of this entire sequence. Imagine being legally required to look like you are about to give a TED Talk every single morning before 8 o'clock, regardless of how you slept, how you feel, whether you are sick, whether it is February and nobody interesting is doing anything. That is approximately the emotional temperature of the 1950s grooming standard. It wasn't vanity. That's the part that matters. It wasn't men who enjoyed getting dressed up. It was men who understood, without anyone sitting them down and explaining it, that the surface was the story, that what other people could see was the only version of you that they could evaluate, and since evaluation was happening continuously, the surface had to be maintained continuously. He looked in the mirror one last time. He straightened the tie a quarter of an inch. He went downstairs. The day had not even started yet, and already he was managing his performance within it. Here is the bluntest possible version of a truth that shaped the entire post-war era. A man's worth was calculated in dollars. Not partially in dollars, alongside other meaningful factors, in dollars, full stop. The 1950s American man was expected to be the financial engine of his entire household. The mortgage, the groceries, the car payment, the children's shoes, the doctor visits, the piano lessons if there were piano lessons, the summer vacation if there was a summer vacation. All of it flowed from a single salary that he earned at a single job and deposited into a single checking account and distributed across the household with the quiet, continuous pressure of a man holding a dam together with both hands and hoping nobody noticed his arms were shaking. And nobody was supposed to notice. That was the rule. Financial struggle in the post-war suburb was not something you discussed with your neighbors. It was not something you mentioned to your friends at the Friday evening gathering. It was not something you processed with your wife in any way that conveyed genuine uncertainty, because genuine uncertainty about money was not compatible with the provider role, and the provider role was not optional. Here is the complicated part. And I want you to really hear this because it's one of the more psychologically interesting aspects of this entire era. The post-war American economy was, by almost any objective historical measure, extraordinary. The factories were running. The GI Bill was sending veterans to college and handing them the financing to buy homes at terms that would seem almost incomprehensible today. The jobs were real. The growth was real. The prosperity was genuine. And yet, the prosperity was also a story that had to be maintained even when the arithmetic made it difficult. The mortgage was fixed, but the furnace was not. The car payment was scheduled, but the children's medical expenses were not. Shoes are perhaps the most perfectly representative symbol of post-war financial anxiety. Children's shoes specifically, because children's feet are apparently engaged in some kind of relentless experimental growth that produces a need for replacement footwear at intervals that no household fully anticipates. You made the money went to the house and the car and the food and the shoes and the 12 other necessary expenses that assembled themselves like a bill of particulars every single month. And if there was leftover at the end, and sometimes there wasn't quite enough, and you moved things around in ways that required a kind of financial juggling that you performed entirely alone at the kitchen table after the household was asleep, you said nothing. Because saying something would have changed what people thought of you. And what people thought of you was, in the 1950s, dangerously close to what you thought of yourself. A man who was struggling financially was not just a man navigating a difficult economic moment. He was a man who was failing at the foundational assignment of his life. His salary was not a number, it was a verdict, delivered by his employer once a year in a conversation he was not fully in control of, measuring his value in a currency that the entire surrounding culture had agreed was the primary one. A raise meant you were succeeding. A flat salary meant you were stagnating. A pay cut, which did happen during slow periods in industries that contracted, was something close to a personal accusation. And none of this, not the anxiety, not the arithmetic, not the midnight calculations, could be said out loud. You absorbed it. You continued. You passed the bread at dinner with the expression of a man who had absolutely everything under control. Because that expression was the product. And the product had to ship every day.
The 1950s American man did not work from a home office. He did not attend meetings in his pajamas. He did not have a hybrid schedule or flexible hours or a standing desk with a blue light filter on his monitor. He put on the pressed trousers and the correct tie, and he left the house at approximately the same time every morning and traveled by car or commuter train to a building somewhere that was not his home, where he would spend 8 to 10 hours being productive and compliant and largely interchangeable. The commute was simply part of it, like weather, like traffic, like the existential understanding that Tuesday would follow Monday with perfect, unbroken reliability. If he took the train, and many suburban men in the post-war era did, because the train corridors that fed into New York, Chicago, Boston, and other major cities had grown dense with the new commuter class, the car belonged to a specific, self-contained world that has no real modern equivalent. Picture it, a long metal car packed with men in nearly identical dark coats holding folded newspapers at exactly the angles required to avoid eye contact with the person 6 inches to the left. The newspapers served multiple functions simultaneously.
They communicated that you were informed. They communicated that you were busy. Most importantly, they communicated that you were not available for a conversation that might drift into anything real. Because conversations on the commuter train did not drift into anything real. They stayed in the approved zones, the weather, the previous night's game, the traffic on route whatever that had been inexplicably worse lately. Brief, horizontal exchanges that contained genuine warmth and zero substance. Both parties knew this, both parties preferred it, because the alternative, talking about how you actually felt about the job you were on your way to, was not something the commuter train had space for. If he drove, the experience was different in texture but similar in emotional content. The radio offered news delivered by men who spoke with the confident authority of people who had decided that certainty was a style choice, and music that ranged from big band arrangements to the early rumbles of rock and roll, which was beginning to reach the suburbs in small, unsettling waves. He sat in traffic that was already beginning to assume the permanent geological quality it would spend the next several decades perfecting. Here is the thing about the commute that I want you to sit with for a moment. A man who commuted 1 hour each way, 5 days a week, was spending roughly 500 hours a year in transit. That's more than 3 full weeks of waking hours. 3 weeks that were not work and not rest, not productive and not restorative, just transit. Time consumed by the geography of his life, the distance between where he slept and where he earned, that had no framework for being acknowledged as a significant cost. He did not have a podcast about it. He did not have an audiobook walking him through a language he'd always wanted to learn. He had the radio and the newspaper and his own thoughts, and his thoughts were mostly about the day ahead or the day behind, and neither direction was particularly restful. And then the day ended, and he reversed the whole thing. Back to the car or back to the train, back through the traffic or back through the commuter corridors, back to the suburb, the driveway, the front door. He walked in, and the household was already in motion, dinner in progress, children in some state of activity or dispute, the domestic machinery of the home running along its own logic, which had not paused to account for his absence and would not fully pause to acknowledge his return. He hung up his coat, he loosened the tie. He had about 45 minutes before dinner, and in those 45 minutes, the day was supposed to disappear. The professional face was supposed to soften into the domestic one, and the man who had been performing competence all day in a fluorescent-lit office was supposed to seamlessly become the man who was present and warm and engaged at the dinner table. There was no acknowledged transition. There was no decompression protocol. There was just the commute ending and the evening beginning and the expectation that the man moving between them could absorb the shift without it showing.
Let me describe the 1950s American office to you, and I want you to really picture it. Rows of identical wooden desks arranged in a grid under fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency just below conscious awareness. The kind of sound you don't notice until it stops, and then you realize how much energy your brain had been spending not noticing it. Men in nearly identical dark suits at nearly identical desks doing nearly identical work, visible to each other and to their supervisors at all times in an open floor plan that had been designed not for collaboration or creativity, but for surveillance and output measurement. In one corner or along one wall or at the end of the room, a private office with a door. This was the boss's office. The door opening and closing was the most legible visual communication system in the entire building. Door open meant routine. Door closed meant either a phone call of consequence or a conversation you were hoping wasn't about you. The boss occupied a role in a 1950s man's professional life that is genuinely difficult to fully translate for a modern audience.
He was not a manager in the current sense, not someone you might disagree with productively in a team meeting, not someone who would offer you feedback that was framed as collaborative growth, not someone you would approach with a concern about workplace culture. He was authority. He was the person who decided whether your performance was adequate, whether your salary would grow, whether your position in the organization was secure. You did not challenge this authority directly. You did not ask pointed questions in meetings. You contributed just enough in group settings to be noticed as competent, but not so much that you seemed difficult or ambitious in ways that made other people uncomfortable. You observed the unwritten rules of the office the way a new resident observes the unwritten rules of an established neighborhood, carefully, over time, through the accumulation of small social data points that nobody would ever explain to you directly. Office politics were not called office politics. They were called the way things work here, and you learned them or you didn't, and if you didn't, the consequences arrived sideways and without announcement. The physical discomfort of the 1950s office is worth pausing on for a moment. The chairs were not ergonomic. Ergonomics as a field of design concern had not yet fully arrived. You sat for 8 hours in a chair that did not support your back in any particularly thoughtful way, under lights that flattened everything, breathing recycled air that smelled faintly of cigarettes, because nearly everyone smoked in the office in the 1950s, and the cultural consensus around whether this was fine was approximately yes, entirely, and produced your output and attended your meetings and managed your relationships with your colleagues with the smooth, careful precision of a man who understood that the job was not just the work. The job was also the performance of doing the work without visibly struggling with doing the work. Lunch was either eaten at a counter nearby with colleagues, which was social maintenance dressed up as a meal, or at your desk in 12 minutes flat, because taking a full lunch break was a statement about your priorities, and the statement it made was not one that ambitious men in 1950s offices were eager to make. The coffee was always bad. Not in the way that coffee can be bad when you have a reference point of good coffee and a vocabulary for describing the distance between them. Bad in the way that something made at 7 in the morning tastes when it has been sitting on a hot burner since 7 in the morning and is now being consumed at 2:30 in the afternoon by men who stopped tasting it sometime around 10. At 5 o'clock, or later if you were the kind of man who stayed late to be seen staying late, which was a strategy many men employed with quiet calculation, you left the building. You walked into whatever the weather was doing. You were, for the length of the journey between the office door and the car door or the train platform, briefly nobody's employee. It was the freest moment of the day. It lasted about 4 minutes. There is a moment in every social introduction that most of us process so automatically we barely registering it happening. The extending of the hand, the brief contact, the release. In 2020's America, this transaction has become almost charmingly optional. You might wave, you might nod, you might offer a fist bump or an elbow or a small apologetic gesture that communicates good intentions in the general direction of another person. The range of acceptable greetings has expanded to the point where the absence of any physical contact at all is now perfectly normal and carries no particular social meaning. In 1952, there was essentially one correct greeting between men, and if you got it wrong in front of the right person at the wrong moment, the social consequences could follow you for years.
The handshake was a character assessment delivered in under 2 seconds. This is not an exaggeration. Men evaluated each other through handshakes with the focused attention of experts running a diagnostic. Too loose, and the word that traveled through the social network afterward was soft, possibly unreliable, not someone you'd want holding a contract with your company. Too aggressive, the crusher, the knuckle grinder, and the assessment shifted to compensating, trying too hard, covering something up. The correct handshake occupied a narrow band between those two failure modes, and navigating it required real-time calibration based on the other person's grip, their position, their apparent expectations, and your own nervous system's behavior under social pressure.
The physics were specific and widely understood without ever being written down anywhere. You extended your hand at the precise moment, not early, which read as eager, not late, which read as uncertain. You met the other hand at the web between thumb and forefinger, which was the anatomically correct contact point, and something every man who grew up in this era learned without being enrolled in any class that taught it. You applied pressure that was confident without being competitive. You maintained eye contact. You released cleanly. You said the man's name if you knew it, because saying someone's name during an introduction signaled that you had been paying attention, and paying attention was a proxy for reliability, and reliability was the primary currency of the professional world. Now add to this the matter of the hands themselves. Cold hands were a liability. They suggested either poor circulation or nervousness, and neither quality inspired confidence in a business partner, or a potential employer, or the father of the woman you were hoping to marry. Sweating hands were a genuine social emergency. Men who were prone to nervous perspiration in the palms, and this is a physiological reality that no amount of willpower fully addresses, developed private countermeasures. The discreet wipe against the trouser leg, executed in the half-second before the introduction, performed with the casual smoothness of a gesture that was absolutely not happening and that you were absolutely not doing. The anxiety about whether the wipe had been noticed was itself one of the primary contributors to the sweating that necessitated the wipe, which is the kind of recursive trap that the 1950s social landscape constructed with impressive regularity. Boys practiced this, not in any formal sense. There were no handshake seminars, no YouTube tutorials, no skill-building workshops for nervous adolescents. The practice happened through correction. Your father took your hand, demonstrated the proper grip, told you to look him in the eye, shook his head when you got it wrong, and offered no particular explanation of why it mattered so much, because the why was assumed to be self-evident. A man who couldn't shake hands correctly was a man who couldn't be trusted with anything more complicated. The logic of this, examined directly, makes essentially no sense. The correlation between the firmness of a person's handshake and the reliability of their character is approximately zero. But the operating logic of an era does not require internal consistency to have real social force. It simply requires widespread adoption, and the 1950s handshake had been adopted so completely, so universally, that it had become indistinguishable from truth. And so every introduction carried the weight of that assessment. Every new colleague, every potential client, every neighbor at the block party, every girlfriend's father, each one was a moment when your character was being read in under 2 seconds through the medium of your right hand. You practiced the face that went with it, confident, unhurried, a slight forward lean that communicated engagement without aggression, and then the release, clean and controlled, followed by whatever the conversation required. You got pretty good at it. You had to. Owning a home in post-war America was not primarily a financial decision. It was a declaration, a visible, public, permanent declaration that you had arrived at the correct destination.
The suburbs that grew up around American cities in the late 1940s and through the 1950s were genuinely unprecedented in scale and speed. Communities like Levittown on Long Island and its counterparts in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, California, and dozens of other states produced thousands of homes in timeframes that would seem impossible if we didn't have the historical record to confirm them. Entire neighborhoods materialized where there had been farmland the previous spring. Streets appeared, street lamps appeared, driveways and front lawns and nearly identical houses with nearly identical floor plans and slightly varied exterior paint colors appeared, occupied, and became the defining physical environment of the American middle class for the next several decades. You bought into this environment because buying into it was what responsible men with families did. The GI Bill had made it financially possible for a generation of veterans who had grown up in apartments or rural houses or the cramped quarters of working-class neighborhoods to access something their parents could not have imagined. A yard, separate bedrooms for the children, a garage, a driveway, a front door that you had chosen and painted and could point to from the street and say, "That one is mine." The emotional weight of that ownership is difficult to overstate for men who had come from the Depression and the war, for men who had watched their fathers lose everything in the economic catastrophe of the 1930s, or who had spent years in the Pacific or in Europe surrounded by destruction and uncertainty. The house was not just a house, it was the physical proof of a restored world. It was stability made visible. It was the answer to every terrifying question the previous 2 decades had asked. But here is what nobody mentioned in the sales literature. The house immediately became a project that would never be finished. The post-war suburban homes were built with the speed and economy that speed and economy inevitably produce. Windows that didn't seal properly in January, pipes that had strong opinions about freezing temperatures and expressed those opinions loudly, basements that viewed the concept of staying dry as aspirational rather than structural, gutters that filled with leaves in October and, if not addressed promptly, began a quiet negotiation with gravity that ended badly for the fascia boards behind them. All of this became your responsibility the moment the previous owner's car turned the corner and the house was yours. And the house had an audience. This is the part of the post-war suburban experience that shapes everything else about it, and I don't want to rush past it. The suburb was a dense, intimate social ecosystem in which everyone could see everyone else's property at all times. Your house faced the street was public. The neighbors walked past, they drove past, they stood in their own driveways on Saturday mornings and looked at your driveway from across the distance of 20 yards and noted, cataloged, and filed everything they observed. The front of the house was a public statement and was maintained accordingly. Fresh paint on the front door, clean gutters, a trimmed hedge if there was a hedge, a flag in the holder if that was your presentation, flower beds that were tended or at least not visibly abandoned. The front of the house said something about you, and what it said traveled through the neighborhood in the efficient, invisible way that all important neighborhood information traveled. The back of the house was more forgiving. The back was where the children's toys accumulated in formations that resisted organization, where the garden that your wife had started with genuine enthusiasm in April became complicated by July and reached a kind of philosophical accommodation with itself by September, where the broken patio furniture waited patiently for the repair that was coming as soon as you had a free Saturday, which was always approximately 2 Saturdays away. But the front had to be right. And so you managed it. You painted it on the schedule it required and not the schedule you preferred. You fixed the gate when the hinge went soft. You replaced the section of front walk where the frost heaves had created a tripping hazard that was also an aesthetic statement you didn't want to be making. You kept the gutters clear, the driveway sealed, the exterior trim painted in a color that you had, frankly, repainted twice already because the first choice looked different in afternoon light than it had at the paint store, and the second choice was better, but still not quite right.
The house was your face in the world of the neighborhood, and your face, as we have already established, had to be maintained. Nothing in the entire catalog of 1950s masculine expectation captures the particular quality of that era's demands on men quite as precisely as the front lawn. And I mean that seriously. Not the job, not the marriage, not the social performance, the lawn. Because the lawn is where all of the impossible standards converged into a single physical weekly obligation that required real labor, delivered no lasting results, and was evaluated continuously by an audience that never said a word about what it saw. The lawn was not a natural thing. That is the first thing to understand.
Grass grows. That is the one thing grass will absolutely do without human intervention, in almost any climate, under almost any conditions. Left alone, it will grow, seed itself, send out runners, invite neighboring species to join it, and within a few seasons produce something that looks like a meadow. A meadow is, from a botanical perspective, a perfectly reasonable outcome. From the perspective of the 1950s suburban social contract, it was a catastrophe. The expectation was not grass. The expectation was a lawn, a specific, curated, geometrically managed version of grass that had been cut to a uniform height, trimmed at every edge with the precision of a man who had decided that the border between his property and the sidewalk was worth treating as a statement of personal character, and maintained in a condition of year-round readiness that required consistent, effortful engagement regardless of what the weather, the grubs, the drought conditions, or your own back were doing. Saturday morning was lawn morning. In the post-war suburbs, this was about as close to secular American life came to a religious observance. Across the neighborhood, the sound of lawnmowers starting up, first one, then another, then a third, created a kind of secular chorus that announced the beginning of the weekend's real work. Men emerged from their houses in work clothes, not the pressed trousers of the office week, but something slightly more casual, and began their circuits. And here is the thing about those circuits that matters. They were watched. You assessed your neighbor's lawn from your driveway. He assessed yours from his. Neither of you said anything about what you observed. Everything was said anyway. A lawn that was slightly too long communicated something. A lawn with a visible yellow patch communicated something. A lawn with dandelions, and here we arrive at the dandelion, which deserves its own extended discussion, communicated something quite specific about the man who was failing to prevent them. The dandelion in the 1950s front lawn was not a plant. It was evidence. Evidence that something had gotten past you, that the defense had been inadequate, that a small, cheerful yellow intruder had established itself in full view of the street and now making a public announcement about your attentiveness as a homeowner. The response to dandelions was chemical in the post-war era, and enthusiastically so. The same industrial infrastructure that had produced so many remarkable things during World War II had, in peacetime, pivoted its considerable synthetic chemistry expertise toward the domestic market, and one of the products of that pivot was the residential herbicide, a spray you applied with a pump canister, walking your lawn in deliberate patterns, addressing each dandelion individually, or broadcasting across the whole surface if the situation had escalated to that point. The ecological consequences of applying these chemicals to suburban lawns at scale across the entire country were not being seriously discussed in 1954. The dandelions were the concern. The dandelions and the crabgrass and the clover and anything else that had the audacity to appear in a space that had been designated exclusively for the correct type of grass, maintained at the correct height, bordered with the correct edge. The lawnmower itself was a significant object. In the early part of the decade, you pushed it in straight parallel lines with the focused intensity of a man who had decided that geometry was a moral position. The lines had to be straight. Visible mowing tracks that wandered or crossed each other at irregular angles were the physical evidence of either inattention or inexperience, neither of which you wanted the neighborhood reading on your lawn on a Sunday afternoon. The riding mower arrived as the decade progressed and was received with the quiet enthusiasm that genuinely useful technology earns. The time it saved on the cutting itself was immediately redirected towards edging, which was the detail work, the clean, vertical line between the grass and the driveway, between the grass and the sidewalk, between the lawn and the flower bed, that separated the men who were keeping up from the men who were genuinely committed.
The correct edge was a precise straight line that said, without words, something that the era's men were not permitted to say with words. I pay attention. I am in control of the things within my control. This small piece of ground is managed, and the management of it reflects something about the management of everything else. Now,
step back from all of this for a moment and look at it. The lawn was grass. It grew whether you wanted it to or not, and it required water that fell from the sky in quantities and timing that you could not influence. It could brown in a heat wave and flood in a wet week and be eaten from below by lawn grubs that arrived on their own schedule with no interest in yours. You could do everything correctly: water it, feed it, treat it, trim it, edge it, address every dandelion individually by name, and a single summer drought could still turn it the color of an old newspaper. And yet, the expectation was that you would maintain it in a condition of permanent, presentable readiness, as though nature had been quietly briefed on the aesthetic standards of the American suburb and had simply needed a reminder. Every single week, for as long as you owned the house. The grass is already growing. It will need cutting again by Thursday. If the house was a man's face in the neighborhood, the car was his soul, or at least the closest thing to a soul that post-war American culture had designated a socially acceptable place for. The automobile in the 1950s was not transportation. It was identity, aspiration, and the one arena of a man's life where he could express genuine enthusiasm without anyone asking him to explain himself. You could talk about your car's engine in a register that would have been entirely inappropriate if applied to almost anything else in your life. You could have opinions about it. You could spend hours with your hands inside it on a weekend afternoon and have that time understood as productive rather than indulgent. The cars themselves were extraordinary objects by any measure, and that is worth acknowledging before we get into what they represented. The automobiles produced in the 1950s were not modest. They were enormous, chrome-layered, aggressively sculpted machines that had been designed by people who had apparently decided that the post-war American highway system was a stage, and the cars driving on it were the performers. Tail fins appeared in the mid-50s and grew annually in a competition with themselves that had no engineering basis and no endpoint. They were pure cultural expression, a declaration in sheet metal and chrome that America was large, prosperous, and aerodynamically optimistic, even when the car in question was pointed at the grocery store. Color mattered enormously. The two-tone paint schemes that became popular in the middle of the decade, cream over coral, white over turquoise, tan over brown, were not chosen casually. A man thought about the color of his car with an attention and deliberation that he would not have acknowledged if someone had asked him about it directly. The car sat in the driveway every day. It was visible to the neighborhood every day. It communicated every day. What it communicated needed to be considered. Sunday afternoon, a man washed his car. This was not a chore in the way that the gutters were a chore or the ironing was a chore. It was different. It was closer to a ritual, a private negotiation between a man and one of the few things in his life that was unambiguously his. The house was the bank's as much as his, technically. The job was the company's. The domestic routines were shared. But the car had his name on the registration. He had chosen it. He had driven it across enough miles that it had learned his particular driving habits, the way he accelerated from stops, the pressure he applied going into corners, the way he handled long highway stretches with one hand resting at the bottom of the wheel. He washed it with a chamois cloth and a bucket of soapy water, and then dried it with a second cloth, working in sections, and the chrome caught the Sunday afternoon light in a way that was genuinely one of the most uncomplicated satisfactions available in the 1950s domestic landscape. Notice that. An uncomplicated satisfaction. So much of a 1950s man's life was complicated. The job was politically complicated. The marriage was emotionally complicated. The finances were arithmetically complicated. The neighborhood was socially complicated. Even the lawn was ecologically complicated in the sense that it was a continuous negotiation with a biological system that had its own agenda.
The car was not complicated. You washed it, and it became clean. You polished it, and it became shiny. The result was immediate, visible, and entirely proportional to the effort. There was no ambiguity, no deferred feedback, no annual review that would tell you months later whether the waxing had been adequate. The car gleamed. You had made it gleam. You could see that you had made it gleam, right now, in the driveway, in the afternoon. For a generation of men who had been handed very few socially approved outlets for any kind of passion, the automobile became the one they poured everything into. Not because they were simple, but because they were human, and humans need somewhere to put the feelings that don't have any other place to go. The car was where it went. And on Sunday afternoon, standing in the driveway with a chamois cloth in one hand and the particular quiet satisfaction of a clean vehicle in front of you, it was almost enough. There is an image that appears in almost every depiction of post-war American family life, whether it's a photograph, a television scene, or a memory recovered from childhood. A man at the head of the dinner table, food on the table, family arranged on both sides, someone passing something to someone else, a moment of domestic completeness that looks from a certain distance like contentment. What the image doesn't show, what no image of that particular moment ever shows, is what it cost the man at the head of the table to be sitting there. The provider role of the 1950s came with terms and conditions that were never disclosed at the outset. By the time you understood them fully, you were already 20 years into the arrangement, and the arrangement had become your identity, and your identity was not something you renegotiated over dinner. You were expected to meet every need of every person in your household: financial needs, physical needs, practical needs, security needs, without complaint, without acknowledging limits, and without ever requesting anything in return, not explicitly. Asking for help was simply not part of the vocabulary available to a man of this era and this social position. Help was what you provided. Needing it was what other people did. The mortgage had to be paid on time, every month, without drama, because a missed mortgage payment was not just a financial problem, it was a statement about whether your family was secure. And the security of your family was your specific, personal, non-transferable responsibility. If the security was in question, the question was about you. The groceries had to be covered, the utilities, the school clothes, the doctor visits, the piano lessons, the modest summer vacation, the Christmas presents that appeared under the tree each December with the cheerful inevitability of something that had been arranged by magic rather than by a man who had spent 3 hours in November doing careful math at the kitchen table after everyone else was in bed, moving numbers between categories, deciding what was possible and what would have to wait until January. The magic was the performance, the math was the reality. And the man who performed the magic was also the man doing the math, and neither of those two people were ever introduced to each other in a room where anyone else could observe them. What made the provider role particularly interesting psychologically, and I want to be precise here because this is genuinely important, was that it was not experienced as oppression by most of the men who lived inside it. It was experienced as purpose. The distinction matters enormously. The man who goes to a job he doesn't love every day because the mortgage payment is due in 12 days and the children need shoes and the furnace made a sound in October that suggested it had formed opinions about the coming winter. That man is not thinking, "I am trapped." He is thinking, "I am doing what needs to be done." And the doing is its own identity. It is not nothing. It is in fact something that many men describe in retrospect with genuine pride, however complicated the full picture turns out to be. The cage and the calling were the same structure. That is what makes it so hard to discuss cleanly. What it cost, and it cost continuously over decades, was the space to be anything other than capable, to have a bad week and say so, to sit at the head of the table and say, "This is a lot," to admit, even in the privacy of your own marriage, that the weight was sometimes heavy in ways that you couldn't fully manage alone.
None of that was available. And so the bread was passed, and the weight was carried, and tomorrow there was another mortgage payment to make.
There is a particular kind of pressure that operates entirely through implication. Nobody states it, nobody writes it down, nobody sits you down and explains the terms, but the pressure is real, and it shapes behavior as effectively as any written rule, perhaps more effectively, because an unwritten rule cannot be challenged or revised or repealed. It simply exists, ambient and total, in the air of the social environment that produces it. The 1950s American man was expected not only to be a particular kind of man, but to have a particular kind of wife, and the two expectations were so thoroughly woven together that pulling them apart, even analytically, requires effort. The wife was supposed to be pleasant, capable, attractive in a way that reflected well on the man who had chosen her, a competent cook, a patient mother, a graceful social presence who moved through neighborhood gatherings and office parties and church socials with the easy warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed all of it, even when she didn't, especially when she didn't. She managed the household with the invisible efficiency of a well-run operation whose smooth functioning was noticed only when it broke down. She maintained the social calendar. She kept the children clean, fed, reasonably educated in manners, and presentable at the moments when being presentable was socially necessary. She was, in the post-war cultural imagination, contentedly busy and contentedly invisible. Now, here is the part that is important to understand about how this connected to the man's experience, because this is often the part of the story that gets left out when we talk about 1950s gender roles. The wife was not just a companion, she was a performance metric. A man was evaluated in part through her. If she was well dressed at the neighborhood gathering, that reflected something about him, his judgment, his taste, his ability to provide the conditions for her success. If the house she managed was orderly and the children she raised were reasonably well behaved, and the dinner she produced on short notice when unexpected guests arrived was good, those were understood, in the ambient logic of the era, as marks in his column as much as hers. He had chosen wisely. He had created the conditions that allowed her to flourish. Her visible contentment was downstream of his adequacy. And by that same logic, the logic that nobody stated explicitly but that everyone understood perfectly, her visible struggle, if it appeared, if it leaked through the surface of the carefully maintained domestic presentation, was a question about him. What had he failed to provide? What had he missed? What was insufficient in the arrangement he was responsible for? This created a psychological dynamic in the 1950s marriage that is worth sitting with. Two people, locked in a mutual performance, each responsible in the ambient social accounting of the neighborhood for the other's legibility. The man's adequacy was partially confirmed by her contentment. Her contentment was partially performed for the purpose of confirming his adequacy. And beneath both performances was a real relationship between two real people who had genuine feelings about the lives they were living, and essentially no cultural framework for discussing those feelings with each other in any depth. The men who were perceptive enough to understand that their wives were in fact not serenely content, that the domestic arrangements of post-war America were placing enormous demands on women as well as men, that the cheerful efficiency was often exhaustion wearing a clean apron, frequently had no idea what to do with that understanding. The culture had given them a role, it had not given them tools for the relationship underneath the role. What do you do when you understand that the person you love is performing contentment for your benefit and possibly for her own survival, and the honest conversation about this would require a vocabulary that neither of you was taught, in a culture that has not only failed to provide that vocabulary, but has actively discouraged its development? Most men in this era did what was available to them. They worked harder. They brought home something, flowers or a small appliance or a piece of jewelry that communicated attention without requiring words. They stayed at the office a little later, which was simultaneously an avoidance strategy and a genuine attempt to solve the problem through the only mechanism the era had provided: more money, more provision, more evidence of adequate performance.
The idealized wife of the 1950s was happy, capable, and quietly grateful. Whether the actual wife was any of those things on any given Tuesday was a conversation that stayed between the two people at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, in the particular silence of two people who have something to say and no map for how to say it. And in most cases, that is exactly where it stayed. Fatherhood in 1950s America occupied a strange and somewhat paradoxical position in the cultural imagination. It was enormously important in theory. The father was the anchor of the family, the moral authority, the example of stability and strength around which the domestic world organized itself. In practice, fatherhood looked quite different from that description, and the gap between the principle and the practice was one of the quieter tragedies of the era.
A man was a good father in the 1950s if he provided financially, if he stayed, if he maintained the household that gave his children a stable environment, if he attended the school plays and the graduations and the important events, if he threw the ball in the backyard on weekend afternoons and drove the family to the beach in July and sat at the dinner table with some regularity. Emotional availability was not part of the job description. Not because fathers didn't feel things about their children, they did, often deeply and intensely, but because the expression of those feelings was not something the culture had equipped them to do, or encouraged them to attempt, or provided any vocabulary for navigating. You loved your children in the way that you had been shown love, through provision, through presence, through the accumulated weight of showing up every single day and doing what needed to be done. That was the template. It had been handed to you by a father who had received the same template from his father, who had developed it in circumstances even harder than yours, the Depression, possibly a war, the particular hardships of the early 20th century that had made emotional containment not a personal preference but a survival strategy. The template had traveled down through the generations intact because nobody had known to examine it, and because examining it would have required a kind of reflective space that the era actively discouraged. One of the primary functions assigned to fathers in this era was discipline, which meant that in many households, a father's most consistent daily presence in his children's lives was as the consequence. The person called upon when something had gone sufficiently wrong during the day that the mother had determined it required paternal authority. Wait until your father gets home. That sentence, that specific sentence, if you grew up in a 1950s household or know someone who did, you understand what it carried. It was not a neutral statement. It was a forecast, a countdown, a small storm warning delivered to children who spent the intervening hours in a state of anxious anticipation that was itself a form of punishment, added to whatever was to come when the door finally opened. And here is the man who walked through that door. He had been at the office since 8 in the morning. He had navigated the commute in both directions. He had managed whatever the day required of him professionally and politically. He was tired in the specific, depleted way of someone who has been performing all day and has not had a moment of genuine rest. He walked in the door, and before he had fully processed the transition from the car to the house, he was handed a disciplinary situation that he had no context for, had not witnessed, did not fully understand, was expected to adjudicate with measured authority in real time. This was called fatherhood. It served almost nobody well, not the children, who experienced their father primarily as a delayed consequence, not the father, who was consistently denied the softer, more connected moments with his children, because those moments happened during the hours he was elsewhere, not the mother, who spent all day managing the household and then handed the difficult moments to someone who had been absent for all the context. The weekends offered something closer to genuine connection, and many fathers of this era took those opportunities seriously in the ways they knew how. The catch in the backyard, the fishing trip,
The long Sunday drive that went nowhere in particular, but moved through the landscape in a shared silence that was, in its own way, its own kind of closeness. Boys noticed these moments. They stored them with the careful attention of children who understood intuitively that they were seeing something that didn't happen often, and that the something mattered, even if they couldn't say exactly why. Daughters had a different experience of their fathers in this era, and it is worth acknowledging specifically. The 1950s father was not culturally equipped to be close to his daughters in ways that went beyond affection and protection. He loved them. He worried about them with a particular intensity that daughters often sensed without it ever being directly expressed. He was prepared to be formidable in their defense. He thought about their futures in the terms available to him: good husband, stable home, adequate provision, because those were the futures the culture made visible. A genuine conversation with his daughter about her inner life, her ambitions, her actual experience of moving through the world, that was rarer, not because he didn't care, but because the script didn't include it, and he had only the script. What the 1950s father left behind, in addition to the house, the savings, the accumulated evidence of decades of provision, was a silence. A vast, rich, complicated silence that his children spent decades trying to read. What was he thinking at the dinner table? What did he actually feel about the life he was living? Did he ever doubt it? Was he ever afraid?
The answers went with him in most cases. He had been a good provider. He had been present. The rest of him, the interior person who had lived behind the role for 30 or 40 years, remained, as it had always been, carefully and completely out of reach. The 1950s American man did not talk about his feelings. This statement sounds simple. It is not simple. It is, in fact, one of the more psychologically consequential facts about an entire generation of men, with effects that rippled forward through decades of family life, through the therapeutic culture that emerged partly in response to what this generation left unprocessed, through the ways their sons and daughters learned or didn't learn to navigate their own emotional lives. But I want to be precise about something before we go further. The emotional silence of the 1950s man was not, in most cases, a personal choice. It was not a character flaw. It was not stubbornness or indifference or cruelty. It was the output of a system, a cultural system, an educational system, a family system that had been building this particular result for decades before the man in question was old enough to make any choices about it at all. The vault was not constructed all at once. It was assembled incrementally, beginning in early childhood, one small correction at a time. You were perhaps 4 years old when you fell and hurt yourself and cried, and someone, a father, an uncle, an older boy at school, told you that boys don't cry. Not with malice, with the genuine belief that they were doing you a favor, preparing you for a world that had no patience for visible distress, teaching you the skill of containment that they themselves had been taught, that they had come to believe was simply how men were, as natural and fixed as height or eye color. You were perhaps 7 when you admitted that you were afraid of something, and the response was brisk and certain, "There's nothing to be afraid of," which was not comfort. Comfort would have acknowledged the fear as real and helped you navigate it. This was dismissal, efficient, well-intentioned, and teaching you that the fear was not a thing to be processed, but a thing to be denied, quickly, before anyone had to deal with it. You were perhaps 11 or 12 when you expressed some uncertainty about something, a friendship, a situation at school, some ordinary confusion of early adolescence, and the response was a kind of firm encouragement to handle it, to figure it out, to not make it a bigger thing than it was, which taught you that uncertainty, expressed out loud, was a burden you were placing on other people, and that the considerate, the masculine, the correct thing was to absorb it privately and resolve it privately and emerge on the other side of it without having troubled anyone.
By the time you were an adult man in 1952, the vault was complete. It had been built so carefully, so gradually, so thoroughly reinforced by every social environment you had moved through that you no longer experienced it as a vault. You experienced it as yourself. The not talking about feelings was not a behavior you performed. It was simply who you were, as natural as breathing and as invisible. The practical consequences of this were significant, continuous, and largely invisible until they weren't. Stress accumulated. Without an outlet, it simply accumulated. The job pressure and the financial anxiety and the performance maintenance and the neighborhood social monitoring and the commute and the discipline situations and the mortgage arithmetic, all of it went into the vault, and the vault had no drain, and the pressure built. Grief had nowhere to go, and so it stayed. Men who lost parents, who lost friends, who experienced losses of various kinds, moved through the formal expressions of grief that the culture provided, the funeral, the black armband, the brief acknowledgement at the office, and then were expected to resume. Resuming was the prescription. Moving forward was the prescription. Time is a healer was the prescription. What time actually did, in the absence of any genuine processing, was bury the grief more thoroughly, where it remained active and unresolved in ways that showed up sideways in other parts of life. And then there were the veterans. Because a significant portion of the men who were building the suburbs and mowing the lawns and commuting to the offices and sitting at the heads of the dinner tables in 1952 had, not very long before, been in a war. World War II had ended 7 years earlier. Korea was still raw and recent. These men had seen things, done things, survived things that had no equivalent in the domestic landscape of a post-war suburb, and no language in the conversation of a post-war suburb, and no place anywhere in the post-war suburb to be acknowledged.
Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a diagnosis in 1952. Shell shock was the older term, and it carried such a weight of stigma and shame, the implication of a man who couldn't handle what other men had handled, that almost no one would accept it applied to them. What was available, culturally, was the concept of the man who hadn't come all the way back, and no man, having survived the war, wanted to be identified as someone who hadn't come all the way back. So they came all the way back, in every visible sense. They took the jobs and bought the houses and mowed the lawns and sat at the dinner tables. And the things they carried that had no language and no outlet expressed themselves in the ways that things without language and without outlets always express themselves, sideways, indirectly, in the distance that families read as coldness, in the quick anger that arrived without apparent cause, in the drinking that increased steadily through the decade, in the silence that was sometimes simply the silence of a man who had run out of ways to be in the room without showing what he was carrying. Think about what you do when you've had a genuinely difficult day. A day that has worn on you in ways that go beyond tiredness, that has left you with something residual and heavy that you need to put somewhere. You might call someone, a friend, a sibling, someone who knows you well enough to hear what you're actually saying under what you're technically saying. You might describe the feeling, not the events, the feeling, and have someone receive that description with genuine attention and offer something back. You might write it down. You might sit with it intentionally for a while and let it move through you, because you've learned that things move through you faster when you give them room than when you block them. Now remove all of those options, every single one, and additionally, believe, genuinely believe, because you have been taught to believe since before you could form the belief consciously, that using any of those options would constitute a failure of character, a weakness, an imposition on others, an unseemly display from a man who is supposed to be managing things, not being managed by them. What is left? A man in an armchair in 1956. The television is on. He is watching it without fully watching it. The family is around him in the room. He is present in every technical sense.
and the vault is full, and tomorrow is Monday. In theory, the weekend was a reward. 5 days of labor, 2 days of restoration. Time to rest, to recover, to be present with the family and the home in the quieter mode that the weekday schedule didn't allow. The weekend was supposed to breathe differently from the week, looser, slower, more human. In practice, the 1950s American man's weekend was a second job with a different dress code and a more eclectic task list. Saturday began with the list. Not a physical list, necessarily, though some men kept those, a notepad in the kitchen drawer, a folded piece of paper in the workshop, a mental catalog maintained with the obsessive precision of someone managing a project that had no completion date. The list assembled itself in the first waking minutes of Saturday morning with the cheerful inevitability of something that had been waiting all week for this exact moment. The gutter on the back of the house where leaves had accumulated since October, the oil change on the car that was 3,000 miles overdue, the section of fence where the neighbor's elm had dropped a branch in the last windstorm and the impact had loosened 2 boards, the storm windows that needed to come down and be stored and replaced with the screen windows, or the reverse depending on the season, which he had been actively meaning to address for the past 2 Saturdays and had not. The leaking faucet in the bathroom, the basement step that squeaked, the driveway crack that would only get worse through the winter if he didn't seal it before the first frost. None of these items was individually dramatic. Collectively, they constituted an open-ended maintenance project that added new items faster than old ones could be completed, because a house is a living system, and living systems have continuous needs, and the man who had agreed to meet those needs had agreed to a contract with no termination clause. He got up. He made coffee. He looked at the sky to assess the weather, not because he needed to know, but because weather assessment was a reasonable thing to do before committing to an outdoor project, and also because looking at the sky gave him 30 seconds of something that was almost peace. Then the work began.
The hardware store on Saturday morning was its own world, a world populated entirely by men, all of whom were wearing the same expression of purposeful resignation, all of whom were holding a physical or mental list, all of whom had come to purchase the specific thing that would allow them to address the specific problem that was waiting at home. The hardware store was one of the few public spaces in the 1950s where men could implicitly admit that something in their house was broken, because the admission took the form of purchasing the correct repair item, which was itself an act of competence. You knew which aisle had the plumbing fittings. You knew the difference between the grades of sandpaper. You bought the right size bolt, the correct weight of extension cord, the specific variety of patching compound for the basement wall. The purchase was its own performance of capability, even when you were only approximately certain what you were going to do with the item once you got it home. Sunday was theoretically rest, and it was, in a narrow technical sense, less physically demanding than Saturday. Church in the morning for families that attended, and most did, at least in the social sense, because attendance was one of the visible markers of a household that was doing things correctly. A large midday meal, the afternoon. The Sunday afternoon of the 1950s occupied a peculiar temporal zone, not productive enough to be Saturday, not distant enough from Monday to be fully relaxed. Men sat in armchairs. Men napped, briefly, without ceremony, in the way that bodies take what they need when they have the rare opportunity to take it, the way water finds its level. These naps were among the most honest things that happened in the post-war domestic landscape because they could not be performed. The body simply overrode the performance for 20 minutes and rested. But then the afternoon changed. Somewhere around 4 o'clock, as the light shifted and the shadows moved and the temperature dropped just slightly, that particular quality of Sunday late afternoon that anyone who grew up in this era remembers with a visceral accuracy, something arrived.
not sadness exactly, not dread exactly, but in the neighborhood of both. Monday was 12 hours away. The commute was waiting. The office was waiting. The boss's door was waiting. The fluorescent lights and the open floor plan and the list of things to be managed and performed and produced, all of it was waiting with the patient certainty of something that has nowhere else to be. He turned on the television. He watched something. He went to bed at a reasonable hour, set the alarm, and lay in the dark for a while, thinking about the week ahead, or thinking about nothing specific, which is sometimes the same thing. The weekend had happened. He could not entirely say that he had rested, but it had happened. And next Friday it would come again, and it would go the same way, and this was called a life, and he was grateful for it, because he knew, in the part of himself that remembered the depression, that remembered the war, that remembered what it looked like when things were genuinely bad, that grateful was the correct response. Even when the gratitude and the exhaustion occupied the same chest at the same time, even when there was no clean way to hold both of them. There is a particular kind of confidence that the 1950s American man was expected to project in relation to broken things. Not the confidence of someone who has been trained, who has studied the system, who carries certification in the relevant field. The confidence of someone who simply handles things, who looks at a problem, any problem, plumbing or electrical or structural or mechanical, and communicates through posture and expression alone that this is within the range of what he manages. Whether it actually was within that range was, in many cases, a question that would not be answered until several hours into a Saturday afternoon, by which point the original problem had sometimes developed opinions on the repair attempt and expressed those opinions in ways that significantly expanded the scope of the project.
The expectation was total. A man was supposed to be capable of addressing household problems across the entire spectrum of domestic systems: plumbing, electrical wiring, carpentry, painting, roofing, appliance repair, concrete work, automotive maintenance. The range of this expectation is worth pausing on, because what it describes is not a skill set that any single person could realistically possess at competent levels without significant dedicated training in each area. It describes a generalist capability that was assumed to exist in every adult male in the post-war suburb, regardless of his actual background, education, or aptitude. Nobody had assessed whether this was reasonable. It was simply what men did. The basement workshop was the physical center of this expectation. In the post-war suburb, the basement or the garage was a man's domain in a way that no other room in the house quite was. The kitchen was his wife's. The living room was the family's. The children's rooms were the children's. The bedroom was shared. But the workshop, the workbench along the back wall with the pegboard above it, the tools hanging on their hooks in the shapes of themselves, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, and the particular dry smell of stored lumber, the workshop was his. The tool collection accumulated over years in the way that meaningful collections accumulate, some inherited from a father, some purchased for specific projects and retained afterward, some acquired because they represented a capability that a man in a house should have available, whether or not a specific need for them had yet arisen. A drill, a circular saw, chisels in graduated sizes, a hand plane, levels in multiple lengths, wrenches organized by size in a configuration that made immediate intuitive sense to the man who had arranged them, and mild confusion to everyone else. The approach to a household repair followed a general sequence that was recognizable across the entire post-war suburban male population, regardless of geography or specific problem. First, assessment. You examined the problem with the focused expression of someone who absolutely knew what they were looking at. This expression was important and was held regardless of whether you actually knew what you were looking at, because the expression itself was part of the process. It communicated to anyone observing that the situation was under evaluation by a qualified person, which bought time and maintained the necessary performance of competence. Second, deliberation.
a period of quiet contemplation that was officially thinking but contained a meaningful component of hoping the problem might provide additional information or reveal a simpler solution than the one currently presenting itself, or possibly resolve on its own if observed with sufficient patience. The deliberation could last anywhere from 2 minutes to 45 minutes, depending on the complexity of the problem and the depth of the man's uncertainty about how to address it. Third, the attempt, which could proceed in any number of directions. If you had done something similar before, the attempt moved forward with genuine efficiency. If you had not done something similar before, and frequently you had not, because the range of household systems was broader than any person's actual experience, the attempt was a form of educated improvisation that occasionally produced excellent results and occasionally produced a situation that was measurably worse than what you had started with. Fourth, the quiet worsening. Not every repair attempt was immediately successful. Some produced a drip that became a stream. Some produced a creak that became a crack. Some revealed in the process of addressing the visible problem that the visible problem was the surface expression of a deeper problem that had been in progress for considerably longer, and now, having been disturbed, proceeding with renewed momentum. This phase was managed privately. You did not announce that the repair had introduced complications. You absorbed the new information, reassessed, and either resumed the attempt with adjusted strategy or set it aside for the following weekend with a note to yourself, mental or physical, about what additional tools or materials would be required. Here is the part of the do-it-yourself culture of the 1950s that nobody discussed openly. The knowledge that underpinned it was often thinner than the confidence that accompanied it. Your grandfather may have built structures from scratch in an era when self-sufficiency was not an aspiration but a literal survival requirement, when there was no hardware store within practical distance and no professional to call and no alternative to figuring it out yourself with whatever was available. Your father may have rewired something, repaired something, built something, in circumstances that were more forgiving of improvisation than post-war suburban construction, which was built to code and contained systems that had specific tolerances and specific correct approaches. You had observed. You had absorbed whatever was transmissible through observation alone. But observation is not instruction, and watching someone do something once is not the same as understanding the system well enough to address any problem that system might present.
The gap between the expectation of competence and the actual competence of any given man facing any given household problem was navigated primarily through stubbornness. And stubbornness is a genuinely useful quality in many repair situations. The willingness to stay with a problem, to try multiple approaches, to refuse to accept that it cannot be solved. But stubbornness without knowledge has a ceiling, and many 1950s men spent their Saturday afternoons operating somewhere in the territory between those 2 points. Calling a professional was always technically available. The plumber existed, the electrician existed, the carpenter and the roofer and the appliance repair technician all existed and were findable and were prepared to come to your house and solve the problem correctly in a fraction of the time the amateur attempt was consuming. But calling a professional before you had exhausted the available self-repair options was, in the social logic of the era, a specific kind of defeat. Not merely an expensive convenience, a defeat, an admission that the system had exceeded your capacity to address it, that you were the kind of man who required external assistance with things that men were supposed to handle. And so you stayed with it. You spent 4 hours on a Saturday doing something a professional could have resolved in 40 minutes, and eventually, in many cases, you solved it. Imperfectly sometimes, adequately usually, occasionally with a result that would impress anyone who understood what the repair had involved. And when it was done, you mentioned it to nobody, because competence was not the achievement, competence was the baseline. You did not receive credit for meeting the minimum expectation, you simply met it, and the next problem waited at a respectful distance, and the tools went back on their hooks in the configuration that made sense only to you. The suburb placed men in a social arrangement that had very few historical precedents, dense enough that you could see your neighbor's lawn from your kitchen window, spread out enough that the relationship was never the organic intimacy of a small town where everyone had known everyone's family for 3 generations. The neighbor was close but not familiar, visible but not fully known, a daily presence who was also, in an important sense, an audience. The relationship had a specific and widely understood grammar, even though nobody had written it down and nobody had explicitly taught it. You were warm, you were helpful in practical, bounded ways, you were interested in the right things, weather, neighborhood developments, the practical logistics of adjacent property, and carefully uninterested in anything that crossed into the personal in ways the arrangement didn't accommodate. You waved from the driveway in the morning, you stopped for a brief exchange over the fence on weekend afternoons, you helped when help was needed, the jump start, the borrowed ladder, the extra hand when something heavy needed moving, and the help was offered and received with the easy warmth of men who understood the currency they were transacting in. These small, practical exchanges were the genuine connective tissue of suburban life, and they were real, and they mattered. But alongside the genuine warmth ran the competition, and the competition, unlike the warmth, was never acknowledged. Every man on the block was watching every other man on the block, not with hostility, not with conscious competitive calculation, but with the constant low-level attention of people who understood that they were all participating in the same project, the project of keeping up, of maintaining the visible surface, of not being the household that fell behind in ways the neighborhood would notice and catalog and eventually quietly discuss. The competition was conducted entirely through action rather than statement. A man who repaved his driveway was not making a statement about the condition of neighboring driveways. He simply needed a new driveway. A man who painted his house was not implying anything about the paint condition of the houses flanking his. He simply needed to paint. A man who bought a new car was not performing prosperity for an audience. He simply needed a new car. Except that everyone understood that all of these things were also performances, and everyone understood that the performances were being evaluated, and everyone engaged in this mutual understanding with the tacit agreement that the understanding itself would never be directly acknowledged.
The falling behind, this is where the real social weight concentrated. A man whose property began to show signs of deferred maintenance was a man whose standing in the neighborhood was quietly adjusting. The lawn that went an extra week without mowing, the front trim that was visibly peeling into a second month, the driveway with the crack that had been present since spring and was now, in October, demonstrably wider. These were not dramatic events. Individually, each was a small, ordinary thing that happened to houses and was typically addressed without consequence. But accumulated, they told a story. And the neighborhood read that story with the attentive, comprehensive literacy of people who had very little else to read on a Tuesday evening, and for whom the story of a neighbor's visible decline carried real emotional content. Nobody made an announcement, nobody gathered to discuss the situation formally, but the observations circulated. They became what the neighborhood knew. And what the neighborhood knew about you, not what was true about you, but what the visible surface of your property communicated to continuous ambient observation, was a form of reputation that was nearly impossible to recover from once it had solidified into neighborhood consensus. A man who understood this, and most men in the post-war suburb understood it without ever having it explained, because they absorbed it the way you absorb any environmental condition you're immersed in, maintained the visible surface accordingly. Not because he was particularly enthusiastic about exterior paint or driveway sealing, because the visible surface was his reputation, and his reputation was something he was building every day in this neighborhood, with this collection of people for the foreseeable duration of his time in this house. The neighbor relationship was, in a certain light, exhausting. The constant maintenance of a performance, the continuous calibration of warmth and distance, the never-ending project of being visible in the right ways and invisible in the right ways simultaneously. But it was also, genuinely, community.
The people across the fence and down the block were the ones who brought food when someone was sick, who stayed late to help with something that had gone beyond a one-person job, who watched the house when you were away and noticed when something was wrong. The web of small exchanges and mutual monitoring that made suburban life occasionally suffocating also made it, in genuine emergencies, a form of collective care that was real and reliable. The neighbor was not just an audience. He was also, in the moments that counted, a fellow participant in something larger than either of you. You simply were not allowed to say so directly. You just handed him the jumper cables and didn't mention it again. The 1950s business suit was not clothing in the casual sense of the word. It was infrastructure, load-bearing infrastructure, the external framework that held a man in a recognizable shape during the hours when the internal framework was under pressure. This requires some explanation. A well-fitted suit communicates something to everyone who sees it. This is not a profound insight, it is simply true, and the reason it is true is not mysterious. The suit signals intentionality. It signals that the person wearing it has considered their presentation, has invested in it, has made the decision to occupy their social environment in a particular way. The signal precedes the person's first word. It operates before the handshake, before the introduction, before any content has been exchanged. In the 1950s, this signal carried more weight than it does now in an era of casual Fridays and remote work and the general loosening of professional dress norms that has occurred across the intervening decades. In 1952, the suit was not one option among several, it was the option. And the man who showed up to the office without it, or who wore it carelessly, creased in the wrong places, sized incorrectly, visibly worn beyond its presentable lifespan, was a man who had made a statement he perhaps hadn't intended. A good suit was an investment, a significant one for a middle-class man in the post-war economy, which meant that most men had 2, possibly 3, and rotated them through the week with the careful attention of someone managing a limited and important resource. The navy suit for the meetings that mattered, the gray for ordinary days, the brown perhaps for Fridays when the office atmosphere permitted a slightly looser interpretation. Each suit's condition was tracked with a precision that would have seemed excessive if anyone had articulated it, but was simply practical, given the stakes. The morning ritual of dressing had a quality that nobody in the 1950s would have described as meditative. The word had not arrived in the vocabulary of the post-war American man, but that functioned as meditation functions. The sequence was fixed: shower, shave, shirt, tie, jacket. Each step completed in a specific order, each element of the result checked against an internalized standard that had been established through years of wearing, observing, and being observed. The repetition itself was settling. The sequence was familiar in the way that familiar things are reliable, and reliability, in a life that contained considerable uncertainty, was not a small thing.
The tie was the one location in the entire outfit where something approaching personal expression was technically permitted. The range was narrow. You were not going to appear at the office in anything that anyone would describe as expressive without a tone suggesting that expressive was not, in this context, a compliment. But within the narrow range, a stripe versus a solid, burgundy versus navy, a particular pattern that was interesting without being distracting, there was a genuine, if small, choice. And men made it with more care than they would have acknowledged, because the tie was visible all day, and the visibility was continuous, and the care put into it communicated, in the specific language of a culture that read character through presentation, something about the person making the selection. Here is what the suit provided beyond warmth and coverage. On the days when the interior felt uncertain, when the confidence was theoretical rather than felt, when the anxiety was present and specific, and the professional calm was a performance rather than a state, the suit said something that the man inside it couldn't quite say for himself. Regardless of what is happening in here, what they see out there is a man who has his situation managed. The suit held the shape when the shape was difficult to hold from the inside.
It was a promise made to the world, to the boss, to the colleagues, to the client, to the neighbor glimpsed from the commuter train window, that the man wearing it was going to show up, meet the standard, perform the competence required. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth sitting with as you think about these men moving through their carefully pressed days, is that the promise was almost always kept. Not because they always felt equal to it, not because the confidence was always real, but because the suit was on, and the suit was reliable, and the version of themselves that the suit presented to the world had to be honored. So they honored it, every morning, for 30 or 40 years. And then they came home and took the jacket off and hung it carefully, and the man inside it was briefly nobody's employee and nobody's provider and nobody's standard to meet. Just a man in a shirt and trousers in a house he owned in a suburb in America in a decade that had asked everything of him. For 45 minutes before dinner was ready, that was enough. Drinking in the 1950s was not recreational in the way that modern social drinking is recreational. A choice, one activity among many, something you did sometimes and didn't do other times based on preference and occasion. In the post-war suburb, drinking was structural. It was woven into the architecture of social life in ways that made abstention mildly exotic, something that required a slight social explanation rather than something that simply went without comment. The after-work drink was an institution, not a choice, an institution. You came home from the office and you had something, a bourbon, a beer, a scotch, if that was your preference, before dinner. This was understood to be a normal component of the evening sequence, as unremarkable as the dinner itself or the evening news. It was not something you made a decision about each day. It was what happened at 6 o'clock. The cocktail party was the primary formal social event of the suburban calendar, and it had a specific function that everyone understood and nobody described directly. You gathered in someone's living room, the ice bucket on the sideboard, the cheese and crackers arranged on a tray that was more about visual intention than actual appetite, and you confirmed collectively, through the medium of drinks and conversation and laughter at the right intervals, that everything was fine, that the neighborhood was in good working order, that the project of post-war prosperity was proceeding as planned. The drinks made this confirmation easier. They smoothed the edges of the performance, reduced the activation energy required to maintain the face, created a warmth that was genuine, even when what generated it was chemical. A man was expected to be comfortable in the cocktail party environment, to move through it with the easy social confidence of someone who had been doing this for years, because he had been doing this for years. To mix a drink competently, the martini in its correct proportions, the old-fashioned built properly, the Manhattan at the right ratio, because a man who didn't know how to make a drink was a man who had ceded a social territory that mattered. Drink-making was one of the few performative domestic skills that the era assigned to men rather than women, and the assignment was taken seriously. The home bar or the well-stocked liquor cabinet was a point of quiet pride in the 1950s household. You kept the right bottles, maintained the right quantities, knew the preferences of the people who came to your home regularly, and had their preferred option available without being asked. This was hospitality, and hospitality was an expression of competence, and competence was always being measured.
The martini debate, and there was a genuine debate, conducted in the serious register that men in this era reserved for things that actually mattered to them, centered on the ratio of gin to vermouth, and whether the preparation was shaken or stirred, and the garnish was an olive or a lemon twist, and the position a man took on these questions was understood to reveal something about his character and his sophistication and his relationship to tradition versus innovation. The staking of positions on the martini was a socially acceptable form of self-expression in a culture that had very few of those, and men used it accordingly. But here is the thing about the after-work drink that matters most for understanding the 1950s man. It was doing a specific job. The job was transition. The job was managing the distance between the professional performance of the day and the domestic presence required for the evening.
The man who walked in the door at 6 o'clock was carrying the residue of the day, the meeting that had gone badly, the comment from the boss that had landed sideways, the financial anxiety that had been running as background noise since morning, the commute, the accumulated weight of 8 hours of continuous performance. The drink softened the edges of that residue. It didn't remove it. It made it possible to set it down temporarily, or at least to pretend to set it down convincingly enough that the dinner table didn't feel the full weight of everything that had happened since 8 in the morning. It worked, within its limits, and for a while, it worked. What it didn't do was resolve anything. The stress it managed at 6 o'clock was still there at midnight. The anxiety it softened on Monday evening had not diminished by Thursday. The accumulated weight that the drink allowed a man to temporarily set down was picked up again the next morning and carried through the next day and set down again the next evening and picked up again the morning after. For some men, the drink that worked at 6 o'clock eventually became the drink that was needed at 5, and then at 4. And then it was not a transition ritual anymore, but something that was filling a space that had grown larger than the ritual could reasonably address. This was noticed by the people around these men. It was not directly discussed, because direct discussion was not how the 1950s suburb addressed anything uncomfortable. It was managed through a kind of silent accommodation. The wife who quietly poured less into the glass, the neighbor who registered the observation and filed it in the category of things a man was apparently going through, the children who understood something was different without having any framework for what the something was. The era had not yet named what was happening. It had not yet connected the drinking to the weight that the drinking was attempting to manage. It had not yet developed the language for the conversation that might have helped. So the drinks continued, and the weight continued, and the gap between them was filled, imperfectly, with everything else the week contained. The television arrived in the American home in the early 1950s with the energy of something genuinely transformative, which it was. Within a few years of its widespread adoption, it had restructured the domestic evening, reorganized family time, and established itself as the primary shared experience of the household, the thing that everyone looked at together, that created common reference points, that told the family, in the warm and confident language of professional storytelling, what American life looked like. The problem was what it showed them. The father on 1950s television was a specific and carefully constructed figure that bore a relationship to the actual 1950s father that was approximately the relationship between a travel brochure and a real destination. He was patient, he was wise, he was mildly, endearingly bumbling in ways that were charming rather than consequential, ways that resolved themselves completely within 30 minutes, including commercial breaks. He went to work in a suit and came home to a warm house and navigated the small crises of family life with the serene confidence of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. He was never depleted, he was never frightened, he was never uncertain about something important, he was never sitting in the armchair at 9 o'clock on a Thursday evening with a drink in his hand and the particular hollow quality of a man who has been performing all day and has run low on whatever the performance requires. Father Knows Best, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. These programs were not documentaries. They were instructions delivered in the gentle, well-lit language of family comedy about what the household should look and feel like, and they were watched by millions of men who were living in households that looked and felt considerably more complicated, more ambiguous, more humanly imperfect than anything appearing on that screen.
The effect of watching an idealized version of your own role performed with perfect competence week after week on a screen in your own living room was one of two things depending on the evening. Sometimes it was comforting, a confirmation that the model existed, that the aspiration was real, that someone had figured out what this was supposed to look like. Sometimes it was quietly demoralizing, a reminder that the distance between the man on the screen and the man in the armchair was measurable, and that the measurement did not favor the man in the armchair. Often both in alternating waves during the same episode.
The commercials were their own instruction set. They told you what to buy in order to narrow the distance between the man you were and the man on the screen. The right car, the right cigarettes smoked in the right social setting with the right expression of relaxed authority. The right appliances that would allow your wife to be the efficient, content domestic presence that the television showed her being. The right lawn products that would produce the green, managed outdoor space that the television showed as the natural condition of the post-war backyard. Advertising in the 1950s was not subtle. It had correctly identified that the aspiration was real, the anxiety about the gap was real, and the space between what men were and what they were supposed to be was a space that products could occupy. And it occupied that space with remarkable efficiency. The television also established, for the first time in human history, a continuous broadcast model of normal. Not normal as in what most people's lives actually contained, normal as in what the shared cultural story said life should look like. And the shared cultural story, filtered through the economics of broadcast television in the 1950s, said that life should look like a well-lit sitcom with a patient father and a cheerful mother, and problems that resolved themselves before the second commercial break. Real life, as the men watching from their armchairs understood, did not resolve itself before the second commercial break. Real life had problems that ran across multiple seasons without resolution, that got worse before they got better, that didn't get better at all sometimes, just changed shape, that required capacities the television father never seemed to need, the capacity to be uncertain, to be afraid, to admit that you didn't know what to do next. Those capacities had no airtime in 1950s television. And so the men who needed the most, the men who were actually living the complicated, imperfect, genuinely demanding lives that the sitcoms simplified into 30-minute packages of warmth and resolution, watched the screen and absorbed the model and went to bed and got up the next morning and tried again. The television hummed in the corner of the living room. The gap between what it showed and what was true was never discussed. And that gap was in its own quiet way one of the loneliest places in the decade. There is a particular kind of willful blindness that is not stupidity and is not denial in any clinical sense, but is something more specific and more culturally produced. It is the blindness of a man who has been taught so thoroughly and from so many directions that his own physical needs are secondary to everything else he is responsible for, that monitoring those needs begins to feel like a distraction from the real work. The 1950s American man had a complicated relationship with his own health. Complicated is perhaps too gentle a word. Avoidant is more accurate. Systematically, culturally, almost philosophically avoidant. Doctors were for emergencies. This was the operating principle, and it was not an individual quirk. It was a generational consensus shared across the suburban male population with the consistency of something that had been formally agreed upon, even though nobody had ever sat down to agree on it. You went to the doctor when something was actively, urgently, undeniably wrong, when the alternative to going was clearly worse than going, when the chest pain or the shortness of breath or the symptom that had been present for 6 months had finally escalated to a point that could not be reasonably attributed to stress or aging or a bad week. Before that point, you managed it, you absorbed it, you made a mental note and then made a second mental note over the mental note of the first one, and eventually the notes accumulated into a layer of unaddressed health information that sat beneath the surface of the daily performance and was known to be there and was not discussed. The internal logic of this avoidance was coherent within the framework of 1950s masculinity, and that is what made it so durable. Durability was the masculine virtue. A man who required maintenance was a man who had somehow failed at the basic assignment of being solid. Going to the doctor before something was visibly wrong was an admission that you were monitoring yourself for weakness, that weakness was a possibility you were taking seriously, that you were perhaps less structurally sound than the performance required.
The circular quality of this logic, I can't acknowledge being unwell because acknowledging it would prove I'm not the kind of man who stays well, meant that it was very difficult to argue your way out of from the inside. Every step of the reasoning reinforced every other step, and the conclusion was always the same: handle it, work through it, wait and see. Your wife wanted you to go to the doctor more frequently than you did. This was understood and managed through a specific marital negotiation that was conducted almost entirely in subtext. She expressed concern in terms carefully calibrated not to imply that you were incapable of assessing your own condition, because that implication would have introduced a different problem, and you heard the concern and acknowledged it just enough to demonstrate that you were taking it seriously, and then nothing changed, and the conversation repeated itself at intervals determined by whatever symptom you were currently not mentioning, but that she had noticed anyway, because she had been watching you with the continuous, attentive concern of someone who understood that the person she shared her life with was not going to tell her when something was wrong. She knew, you knew she knew. The knowing circulated between you without being spoken, because speaking it would have required one of you to formally acknowledge that the system was not working as presented, and formal acknowledgments of that kind were not readily available in the 1950s domestic vocabulary. When you finally went to the doctor, and eventually you went because eventually the symptom crossed whatever threshold you had set, consciously or unconsciously, for what constituted a legitimate medical concern, the appointment itself was another performance. You minimized. Every man in this era minimized at the doctor's office with the focused efficiency of someone who has rehearsed the presentation and is committed to the version that does not convey excessive concern. The symptom that had been present since February was described as something that had started recently. The chest discomfort that had been waking you up 3 nights a week was described as occasional mild pressure that was probably nothing. The fatigue that had been accumulating since 1948 was attributed to a busy period at work that was almost certainly about to ease up. The doctor, who had seen a great many men of your exact description, with your exact communication style and your exact approach to medical disclosure, had learned to work around the minimization to reach the actual clinical picture. The actual picture was, in many cases, more concerning than the presented version, and the gap between the two was not dishonesty exactly, you were not lying, but a kind of unconscious editing that removed from the narrative anything that would have confirmed a weakness you were not prepared to acknowledge. Men died of heart attacks in their 50s in the 1950s at rates that the following decades would recognize as connected to these patterns, to the deferred care, to the unmanaged stress, to the unaddressed symptoms, to the years of absorbing what should have been processed and carrying what should have been set down. They did not die of surprise, most of them. They died of a long accumulation of signals that had been received and filed under managed later and addressed through the mechanism of continuing to work because working is what you did, because stopping was not available, because the mortgage was due and the family needed the provider to remain present and functional and showing up. And then, the man who had spent 30 years prioritizing everything except himself was lying in a hospital bed looking at the ceiling, discovering with something that was not quite irony, because irony requires a distance from the situation that he did not have, that he had apparently been more important to the whole arrangement than he had been willing to admit while he could still do something about it. His body had been telling him that for years. He had been too busy to listen. Despite the gleaming surface of the post-war prosperity story, the new cars, the new houses, the appliances arriving in succession like gifts from a generous future, the sense of collective forward momentum that defined the decade's cultural mood, many of the men living inside that story were managing financial realities that were considerably tighter than the story suggested. The mythology of post-war prosperity was genuine in its foundations. The economy was growing, wages were rising, opportunities were real. The trajectory was, by historical comparison, extraordinary, and the men who had survived the Depression and the war understood this in a cellular way. They had felt the alternative in their bodies, and this was unambiguously better.
But better than a catastrophe is not the same as comfortable, and comfortable is not the same as secure. And the gap between the prosperity that was visible on the surface of suburban life and the arithmetic that produced that surface was in many households a gap that was maintained through continuous, effortful, invisible management.
The mortgage payment was fixed and predictable, which was one of its few mercies. Everything else was not. The grocery bill varied, the children's medical needs varied, the car, which was both a necessity and a significant ongoing expense, had its own ideas about when it required attention and how expensive that attention would be. The house, as we have discussed at length, was a continuous maintenance project with an unpredictable cost structure. The furnace in November, the roof after a bad winter, the windows that needed replacing, the appliance that had reached the end of its practical lifespan, the unexpected expense that materialized from nowhere, which is to say from the ordinary, continuous friction of maintaining a household over time. None of these events were dramatic individually. Collectively, they constituted a low-grade financial pressure that many men carried for decades in nearly complete silence. The credit industry was expanding in the 1950s with an enthusiasm that was new and, in retrospect, consequential. Consumer credit, the installment plan, the department store charge account, the early credit card, made it possible to close the gap between the life you were presenting and the finances that actually underpinned it. You could acquire the television before you had fully saved for the television. You could put the new appliance on account. You could manage the timing of large expenses in ways that smoothed the visible surface even when the underlying arithmetic was strained. This was useful. It was also a mechanism for extending the gap between appearance and reality rather than addressing it. The gap was still there. The gap was now also accruing interest. A man who was struggling financially in the 1950s had essentially no approved outlet for that struggle. Therapy was expensive, stigmatized, and for most middle-class suburban men of this era, simply not something that existed in the range of available responses to difficulty. Discussing it with friends was not possible without violating the mutual fiction of prosperity that the neighborhood maintained collectively. Discussing it with his wife in any way that conveyed genuine uncertainty was not possible without undermining the provider presentation that was foundational to the marriage's architecture. What was available was the kitchen table at midnight, the balance in the checking account reviewed against the list of upcoming obligations in the particular silence of a sleeping house with the specific quality of attention that anxiety produces, focused, repetitive, circular, going over the same numbers from different angles, hoping that one of the angles would produce a better result than the others had. The numbers did not change between reviews, but the reviewing continued, because stopping it required either a solution or the capacity to set the problem down temporarily, and the capacity to set it down temporarily had been trained out of these men so completely that it was no longer accessible. He closed the kitchen drawer, he went to bed. He lay in the dark next to his sleeping wife and ran the numbers one more time, and eventually fell into the shallow, insufficient sleep of a man whose mind had not fully stopped working. In the morning, the pressed trousers, the correct tie knot, the expression of a man who had everything managed. The performance was everything. The kitchen drawer was his alone. Somewhere in the middle of a life, usually around the point where the children were old enough to need less, the mortgage had been partially absorbed into the background, and the job had settled into its permanent shape, a question arrived. It arrived quietly, without announcement, without the dramatic clarity of a crisis. It was more like a presence in the peripheral vision, something noticed from the corner of the eye that disappeared when looked at directly, but returned with patient consistency to the edge of the field of vision. Was this it?
Not dramatically, not in despair, not with the theatrical anguish of someone having a breakdown, in the quiet, considered way of a person who has been moving in a specific direction for a long time and has paused briefly to look up from the path and check whether the direction is still the right one. Was this the life? Was this the shape of it? Was this what the choices had added up to? And if so, was the sum what he had imagined when the imagining was still available to him back before the mortgage and the children and the commute had claimed the space that imagining used to occupy?
The culture of the 1950s had not prepared a place for this question. There was no approved venue for it, no legitimate structure through which a man could examine the architecture of his own life with any honesty and receive anything useful back. Therapy was not available in any meaningful sense to the ordinary middle-class suburban man of this era, not practically, not financially, and certainly not without the stigma of a man who could not handle things, which was the stigma most likely to destroy the very identity he was trying to examine. Male friendships, as we've discussed, did not go to this place. The conversation stayed in the approved zones. The question could not be asked over a beer in someone's backyard on a Friday evening without immediately violating every unwritten agreement about what those conversations were for. The marriage was perhaps the most logical place for the question, the one relationship in the 1950s man's life that was, in principle, intimate enough to hold something this personal. But the marriage, as we have also discussed, was itself a performance, a mutual arrangement whose smooth functioning depended partly on neither person destabilizing it by asking whether it was the right arrangement. To ask his wife whether this was the right life was to ask a question that implicated her as much as him, that threatened the stability of something they had both invested enormously in, that had no guaranteed good answer and several clearly bad ones. So the question went unanswered. It expressed itself, instead, in the ways that large, unasked questions always express themselves in people who have nowhere legitimate to put them. The boat, the classic 1950s midlife acquisition, a vessel purchased at a cost that produced a brief period of visible domestic tension, justified as a practical recreational investment, and understood by everyone involved as something that meant more than the official justification. The boat required maintenance, which gave the man something absorbing to do on weekends that was his alone, that involved tools and focus and the satisfying logic of a mechanical system that rewarded attention. It could be taken out on the water, where the distance from the shore was both physical and temporarily psychological, where the question could drift without destination for a while, in the open air, away from the lawn and the commute and the performance. The question never fully resolved on the boat, but it could breathe there. Some men addressed the question through affairs, a choice that rarely produced the clarity it was seeking and consistently produced a second layer of complication on top of the first. What the affair was actually seeking, in most cases, was not primarily physical. It was the feeling of being someone who had not yet calcified, someone whose life had not yet assumed its final shape, someone for whom a different version of things was still imaginable. The affair was a question about the future disguised as an action in the present, and the answer it produced was almost never the one the question was actually asking. What the era did not provide, could not provide, given its assumptions about what men needed and what they could handle and what was appropriate to discuss, was any legitimate structure for the midlife question. No cultural permission to sit with it seriously, no social framework through which a man could say to someone who could receive it, "I am 43 years old and I have been living this life for 20 years and I am not certain it is the right one and I would like to think about that with some help." The vocabulary was not available. The venue was not available. The man who was brave enough or desperate enough to formulate the question anyway found himself in a room where nobody had the equipment to respond to it. So the question went back into the vault, and the boat sat in the driveway, and Monday came again,
reliable and absolute, and the pressed shirt was ready and the tie was knotted correctly, and the man who had everything managed walked out the front door and got in the car and drove toward the horizon of another week. One of the stranger features of the 1950s American culture, and it had several, all of which become stranger the longer you look at them directly, was its insistence not merely on happiness, but on the continuous, visible social performance of happiness. This goes beyond the reasonable human tendency toward optimism or the understandable desire to present a positive face to the world. This was something more specific and more demanding. The post-war cultural consensus in America was that this was the best time to be alive in the best country in the world, and that the correct response to this fact was consistent, legible, socially visible contentment. The house, the car, the family, the neighborhood, these were not just good things, they were the proof, the material evidence that the project of American prosperity had delivered on its promises, and the man who had received those deliveries was expected to appear grateful for them in a way that was publicly, continuously readable.
The man who seemed flat at the neighborhood gathering made other people uncomfortable, not because they were unkind, but because his flatness introduced a question. Was something wrong with the arrangement that nobody wanted to sit with? The collective story required collective maintenance, and a man whose demeanor suggested he was not fully persuaded by the story was, however unintentionally, undermining the shared project. So you kept the face, you made the joke, you poured the drink, and confirmed through your energy and your laughter and your visible engagement that the project was going well, that you were a man who was where he was supposed to be, and glad to be there. Here is the honest cost of this. Performing an emotion you do not consistently feel is work, not the satisfying work of a project completed or a problem solved, but the draining, continuous work of maintaining a gap between interior reality and exterior presentation. It requires monitoring, it requires adjustment, it requires the constant management of leakage, the moments when the interior pushes toward the surface and must be redirected before it becomes visible. A man who performed contentment every day for 30 years, who woke up, assessed the actual weather of his interior, noted that it was complicated or tired or anxious or simply flat, and then generated the required sunny presentation for the day, was expending energy on that generation every single day, energy that went unacknowledged because the performance, if successful, was invisible. Nobody thanked him for the effort, nobody could see the effort. The whole point was that the effort could not be seen. The gratitude was real. Let me be clear about this, because it matters. The men who built the suburbs and filled them with families and maintained them through decades of continuous effort were not, in most cases, secretly miserable people performing a contentment they didn't feel at all. The gratitude for what the post-war era had delivered, after the Depression, after the war, after the hardships that had defined the preceding decades, was genuine and deep and grounded in real contrast with real alternatives. But gratitude and happiness are not the same emotion, and the conflation of the two in the 1950s cultural script created a specific trap. You were grateful for the house, you were grateful for the job, the family, the country, the stability, and you were also sometimes profoundly uncertain whether the life assembled around you was the right one, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that repudiated the gratitude, but in the quiet, persistent way of a person who has made a series of reasonable decisions and arrived somewhere that is adequate in most of its dimensions, and somehow in some dimension that has no clear name, slightly not quite right. That uncertainty had no home in the 1950s. It had nowhere to go. And so it went nowhere. It stayed. It circulated quietly through the years. It sat in the armchair on Sunday evenings when the particular quality of the light announced that Monday was close. It was present in the kitchen at midnight when the numbers in the drawer were being reviewed for the third time. It was in the car on the commute, in the 30 seconds between waking up and the list assembling itself, in the moment after the jacket came off and before the domestic evening began. It was there the whole time, and it was never, not once, directly addressed. Because addressing it would have required a man to say, I have everything I'm supposed to want, and I'm still not entirely sure I'm fine. And in 1950s America, that sentence had no place to land. The 1950s American man did not, for the most part, leave behind detailed accounts of his interior experience. He left houses. He left cars that were eventually sold or rusted or passed down. He left savings accounts and insurance policies and the physical evidence of decades of provision.
He left children who grew up in the stable environments he had maintained with continuous, effortful attention. And he left silence. Not hostile silence, not indifferent silence. The silence of a man who had been so thoroughly shaped by a culture that had no space for his interior life, that the interior life had, over time, become inaccessible even to him. Not locked away exactly, more like a room that hadn't been opened in so long that the door had swollen in its frame, and the key had been misplaced, and the contents, whatever they were simply no longer retrievable through ordinary means. The children who grew up in those households absorbed the template without being explicitly taught it. Boys watched their fathers contain themselves and learned containment through observation, not through instruction. Nobody sat them down and said, "This is how you manage your emotional life as a man," but through the thousands of small moments in which the available model showed them what masculine response to difficulty looked like: silence and competence, forward motion, the problem addressed, the feelings unremarked upon, the next thing handled. Girls learned something different and equally consequential. They learned what men were like from the inside of a household with one. They learned what to expect from the men they would eventually share their lives with, what was available, what was not, where the warmth lived and where the distance lived, and how to navigate the territory between those two things. They carried that learning into their own adult relationships, where it shaped what they sought and what they accepted, and what they spent years sometimes trying to understand.
The children of the 1950s man, the baby boomers who grew up in those suburbs and eventually became the generation that interrogated, loudly and publicly and with enormous cultural energy, the arrangements their parents had accepted without interrogation, were not rebelling against their fathers so much as continuing something their fathers had started in the only way available to them. The foundation was solid enough that the next generation had the security to ask questions the previous one could not. He did not ask them. He made it possible for someone else too. The relationship between the aging 1950s man and his adult children, when those children finally became adults capable of asking better questions, was often a delicate and ultimately incomplete negotiation. A son who wanted to understand what his father had actually felt, what the job had really been like, whether he had ever doubted any of it. That son was asking for a kind of retrospective openness that required a vocabulary the father had never developed and a willingness to be vulnerable that the culture had spent 70 years training him to suppress. The goodwill was sometimes there, the capacity, in many cases, was not. And then he was gone. And the understanding that arrived after, the recognition that the distance had not been indifference, that the silence had not been an absence of feeling, but a container too full to open, that the man who had passed the bread without speaking had been full of something he had never found a way to say, arrived in a form that could no longer be used as the basis for a conversation. That understanding lived in the children instead, carried forward, informing the way they raised their own children, the way they built their own marriages, the way they moved through their own emotional lives with a vocabulary and a freedom that the man who made that vocabulary possible had never had access to himself. This is the inheritance, complicated and imperfect and genuinely extraordinary all at once. We come back to him now, the man in the driveway. The white undershirt and the khaki trousers and the leather shoes he polished last night out of habit, the garden hose in his hand, the lawn behind him already trimmed, the car beside him already gleaming, the house at his back, painted and shuttered and holding its shape. From the outside, he looks like a man who has figured it out. From the inside, from what we've spent tonight together inside, he looks like something more complicated and more human and in a certain light more extraordinary than the surface suggests. He is afraid sometimes in a cellular way that has no approved language. He is tired, with a tiredness that the Sunday nap cannot fully address. He is uncertain about things that the culture has told him a certain kind of man should be certain about, and the uncertainty lives in him without a home, moving from room to room in the interior of his house, never quite finding somewhere to settle. He carries the mortgage and the commute and the office and the neighbor's assessment and the wife's needs and the children's needs and the financial arithmetic and the lawn and the car and the gutters and the leaking faucet and the quarterly review and the social performance of the cocktail party and the Sunday evening wait of Monday's approach and the question he cannot ask and the feelings he cannot name and the memory of things that happened before the suburb that he will not speak of. He carries all of it, every day, in the pressed shirt and the correct tie knot, with the firm handshake and the adequate answer, and the face that says everything is managed. And here is the thing that I want you to take with you into sleep tonight. He was not wrong to want the house. He was not wrong to want the stability, the family, the neighborhood, the visible evidence that the project of his life was succeeding. He was not wrong to work for it with everything he had, every day, for decades, without complaint, without acknowledgement, without anyone ever fully asking him how he was doing and meaning it in the way that question deserves to be meant. What was incomplete, what the era got genuinely, consequentially wrong, was the part where nobody asked, the part where the culture built a role for him and handed it to him and said, "Here, this is what a man is," and watched him carry it for 30 or 40 years and never once paused to ask what it weighed. The performance of competence was so thoroughly demanded and so thoroughly rewarded that it became impossible to step outside of it long enough to say, "This is a lot, and I am carrying it, and I could use something other than silence." That conversation should have happened. It didn't. And the men who needed it most were, by the training of their own lives, the least able to initiate it. But they showed up every morning. The alarm went off, and they swung their legs over the side of the bed and put their feet on the hardwood floor and began assembling themselves for the day. They pressed the shirt and knotted the tie and shook the hand correctly and drove the commute and sat through the meeting and came home and sat at the head of the table and passed the bread. They did it for 30 years. They did it in the only language they had been given, which was the language of presence and provision and showing up without stopping. And the world you live in tonight, this comfortable, complicated, more emotionally literate world, was built in no small part on the foundation they laid down in silence, in the years when silence was the only option, with a love that was real, even when it was entirely unexpressed. Good night. You are resting on something solid. Someone built it for you, and they would not have told you that themselves, but it was true. It was always true.